Wyoming Territory. Summer of 1874, thunder cracked over the Big Horn Mountains as the girl in the red dress leapt onto the back of a dapple gray mare, clutching nothing but a worn burlap sack. Mid-afternoon light broke through the storm clouds just enough to glint off her tangled dark hair and the iron in her eyes. She kicked hard, and the horse bolted down the muddy trail behind the trading post, hooves throwing up wet earth. Behind her, shouting, a man's voice, her uncle. He had caught her picking through the coin drawer again, and this time he meant to do worse than slap her. She did not look back. "Hey!" A voice called from the trees to her right, low, steady male. "You running or stealing?" She turned her head just enough to see a tall man on a bay gelding keeping pace with her, his hat low, rifle across his back. His shirt was half unbuttoned, soaked from the rain, and his jaw was bruised like he had been in a brawl that morning. There was something in his face, not judgment, not pity, just interest, like he had seen wild before and liked it. "I ain't stealing if it belonged to me first," she snapped, pulling the sack tighter under her arm. "Fair enough," he said, matching her speed. "I like you wild." She blinked at him, startled, but he grinned easy and just kept riding beside her like they had planned it all along. "My name's Vaughn," he added. "Vaughn Fletcher." She did not answer right away. A low branch whipped past her shoulder. The wind stripped the tears from her face before they could fall. "Lark," she said finally. "Lark Foster." They rode hard for another hour until the weather broke and the land opened into soft hills and dry brush. They stopped under a cottonwood tree by a stream. Lark slid off her horse barefoot, her sack clutched to her chest, and sank down on a flat rock. Her dress was torn at the hem. She looked up at him like she expected him to tell her to go back. Vaughn dismounted and tied both horses. He poured water from his canteen into a tin cup and handed it to her without a word. Lark drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and looked away. "You got someone chasing you?" he asked. "My uncle. I lived with him after my mama died. He thinks he owns me," she said, voice flat. "Where's your daddy?" "Left before I was born." Vaughn crouched down across from her, elbows on his knees. "You got a plan?" Lark opened the sack and pulled out a folded piece of calico, a small locket, and $3 in coins. "This," she said. "That's my plan." Vaughn looked at her, really looked this time. She was young, maybe 20, but there was nothing soft about her. She had the kind of fire folks tried to beat out of girls early. Somehow she still had it. "I know a place 2 days south near Shell Creek," he said. "Quiet. Good folks. You could work there, start over. I do not need saving." He leaned back, not offended. "I was not offering to save you. I was offering to ride beside you." Lark looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. They rode slow the rest of the day, stopping only when the horses needed it. That night they camped under the stars out past the edge of the prairie. She sat on one side of the fire, knees pulled to her chest, dress drying in the heat. He sat on the other side, whittling a piece of pine into something that did not yet have a shape. "What happened to your face?" she asked. Card game went sideways in tense sleep. "I said something the wrong man did not like." "You always say what you think." He gave a small shrug. "Most times. I like that." He smiled, a quiet kind of smile. "You always run when things go wrong, most times." "I like that," he said. She flushed but did not look away. The fire crackled between them. Wind moved through the grass like hands. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. Vaughn set the whittling knife down. "Because you looked like you were worth the trouble." She stared at the flames. Her shoulders tightened, then eased. "I have not been worth much to anyone before. You are to me." Neither of them said anything after that, but she did not sleep far from him. The next morning she woke first and found him already heating coffee in a battered pot. He handed her a cup before she even asked. She wrapped her hands around it and said, You really think there is work at that place? I know there is. I did fence work there last spring. The owner is a widow, tough as nails, but she will take in anyone who pulls their weight. They rode again, through dry scrub plains and long ridges of stone. At one point, Vaughn rode ahead to check a stream crossing, and when he came back, Lark was waiting with her sack in her lap and her eyes red. She stood up and met him at the edge of the water. I was scared, she admitted. When you did not come back right away, I thought maybe you left. I do not leave people I care about, he said simply. She looked at him like she did not know what to do with that. They made camp early that evening, and she cooked beans while he set up a lean-to against the wind. As the sky darkened, she pulled the locket from her sack and ran her thumb over it. It has a picture of my mama in it, she said. She used to sing to me when I was little. Said I had a loud soul. Vaughn leaned back on his elbows and watched her. She was right. Lark smiled, slow and uncertain, but it stayed on her face. That night, as the stars came out, she moved her bedroll closer to his. I do not snore, she said. I do, he replied. They both laughed low and quiet, and then fell asleep with the fire crackling between them and the sound of the wind in the trees. Neither of them noticed that they had already started falling in love. By the second morning, the land had begun to rise into shallow ridgelines, wind-shaped and dry, with sagebrush crawling up the sides like stubborn old ghosts. The horses moved slower over the uneven ground, and Vaughn kept glancing west, reading the sky the way some men read scripture. Lark noticed, but she didn't ask. She watched the horizon the same way he did, her eyes narrowed, her thoughts behind them. They passed a broken windmill just past midday. Its blades hung limp, rusted into stillness. Vaughn paused to water the horses beside a shallow bend in a dry creek, and Lark walked ahead, boots scuffing red dust. She squatted beside a patch of Indian paintbrush and ran her fingers along the petals like they might tell her something. You ever do this before? She asked without turning. Do what? Leave one life behind and try to build another that don't belong to you yet. Vaughn tightened the cinch on his gelding before answering. Yeah, once. What happened? Didn't take. She looked back at him then, not with pity but a kind of quiet understanding. I don't know if I'm good at starting things. You don't have to be good at it, he said. Just willing. They made it another 6 miles before Vaughn's horse caught a stone and went lame. He pulled up beside a cluster of juniper and dismounted, crouching to check the gelding's front hoof with careful fingers. Lark watched from the saddle, one hand resting on the pommel. He gonna be all right, needs rest. Stone bruised him. We push too far and he'll go lame for good. She nodded once, then slid down from her mare. Then we rest. They set up camp before the sun dipped, pulling the horses into the shade and stringing a line for their gear. Vaughn built a fire low and careful, shielding it with flat rocks. Lark gathered wood without being asked, snapping branches with her knee. As the fire caught, she sat cross-legged and pulled a small tin from her sack. Inside were dried apple slices, curled and browned with age. Traded for these last winter, she said, handing him one. I've been saving them. He chewed slowly, the tartness catching at the back of his tongue. Why save something like that? For when I needed reminding there's good things. He didn't say anything, just reached for a second piece and nodded his thanks. Later, as the sky settled into the deep indigo of early night, Lark leaned back on her elbows and watched the stars blink into place. You ever think about marrying? She asked. Vaughn didn't look up from the blade he was sharpening. Not lately. That mean you used to? Yeah. What stopped you? She died before I asked. Lark didn't flinch or offer sympathy. She just drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. I was supposed to marry a boy from town once, she said. He had landed a good team of mules, parents who liked me, but he wanted me smaller than I am, quieter. You don't seem the type to shrink. I tried, didn't work. She looked over at him. I guess I like being seen. Vaughn set the stone aside. I see you. She didn't answer right away, but the wind shifted and her voice came soft through it. That's the first time someone said that like it meant something. He didn't move toward her. He didn't need to. The fire burned down to embers and the horses slept standing. Lark lay on her side, her back to the dying light, and listened to Vaughn breathe. Not deep. Like he was awake too, thinking the same thoughts she couldn't name yet. In the morning, the limp in Vaughn's gelding had eased just enough to press forward. They moved slowly, Vaughn walking beside his horse to ease its weight, Lark riding ahead and then circling back. She didn't say anything about staying close. Neither did he. By mid-afternoon, the first post and rail fence of the Shell Creek homestead came into view, stretching across a narrow valley dotted with cottonwood and fenced pasture. Smoke rose from a chimney half a mile ahead. Vaughn tipped his hat back and exhaled. "That's it," he said. "You still want it?" Lark looked straight ahead. "I want something that isn't behind me." They reached the gate just as a woman in a faded blue dress stepped out from the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Her hair was braided tight, her expression unreadable. Vaughn raised a hand. "Afternoon, Mrs. Caro." The woman nodded once. "You bring trouble, Vaughn Fletcher?" "No, ma'am, just someone who works hard." Mrs. Caro looked at Lark for a long time, then she nodded again. "We'll see." Lark dismounted and squared her shoulders. She didn't wait for permission to lead her horse toward the shed. Vaughn watched her go. "You trust her?" Mrs. Caro asked. "I do." "Then she's got a place." That night, Lark swept out the bunkhouse and laid her bedroll along the far wall. Vaughn leaned against the doorframe and watched her tuck her sack beneath her blanket. "You gonna stay?" he asked. "I think so," he nodded. "I'll be around. Got work south of here, but I ride through often." "I'd like that." Vaughn looked at her then, and his voice dropped low. "You ever need more than just a place to sleep, Lark Foster, you come find me." She stepped close, eyes steady. "I might." He didn't kiss her, he didn't touch her. But when he rode away the next morning, she watched him until he disappeared past the ridge, her arms folded tight across her chest, holding something new she didn't yet have words for. The first frost came early that year. By the time Lark had been at the Shell Creek homestead a month, the mornings stung with cold and the cattle moved slower through the fields. Her hands cracked from the milking, her back ached from lifting feed sacks, but her eyes stayed bright. She rose before the sun and worked until it dipped again, and Mrs. Caro never had to tell her twice. She hadn't seen Vaughn since the day he rode off. No letters, no word. But some evenings, she'd step outside the bunkhouse and stare west, watching the sky bruise down into dusk, and she'd wonder where he was, if he still carried the shape of her name in his thoughts. One such evening, she was scraping mud from her boots when the dogs began to bark. She turned and saw a rider cresting the hill, silhouetted in the last light. The way he sat the saddle, easy and tall, she knew it before the wind carried the sound of hooves. Vaughn reined in at the gate and dismounted slow. His coat was dusted white at the cuffs, and he carried a new scar along his jaw, thin and pink, like a thread pulled too tight. He tied his gelding and walked toward her without speaking. "I thought maybe you forgot the way," she said. "I didn't. You look like you've been in trouble." "Not mine," he said. "A man in Powder River got drunk and started swinging. I stepped between him and a boy couldn't fight back. Took a bottle to the face for it." She nodded once. "That's the kind of thing you'd do." "I hoped you'd say that," he said. She turned toward the barn. "There's stew inside. I made too much." "I was hoping you did." He followed her in. the smell of hay and wood smoke thick in the air. The horses shifted in their stalls, calm and familiar. Inside the kitchen, Mrs. Carrow had left a pot on the stove and 2 bowls beside it. Lark ladled the stew without asking if he was staying. She handed him a bowl and they sat on the back steps to eat. "Work going all right?" he asked between bites. "I'm learning to shoe mules next week," she said. "Mrs. Carrow said the blacksmith's too old to keep up, so she's teaching me." He looked over at her, his spoon paused mid-air. "You want to do that? I want to know how," she said. "Feels like knowing how to stand still and stay free at the same time." He set his bowl down. "I brought something." She raised an eyebrow. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He handed it over without ceremony. She unwrapped it and found a leather-bound book, worn at the edges with a pressed violet tucked inside the front cover. "I asked around for something that might matter to you," he said. "Found this in a mercantile that was closing down. Thought maybe you'd like to write your own things." She ran her thumb across the pages. "I never had paper that was mine." "Now you do." She looked up at him. "You always bring gifts when you come back." "No, just to the ones I miss." She closed the book, held it against her chest. "You were gone a long time." "I didn't want to show up empty." "You're not." They sat quiet a while, the cold coming in around them, but neither moved. The stars were out full now and the air smelled like cedar smoke. He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about land." "Yours?" "Ours, if you want it." She turned to him, eyes sharp. "You asking me to build something with you?" "I am." Just like that, no flourish, no need for it. She stood, stepping down into the dirt where his boots sat. "You sure?" "I am." She laid the book on the step and reached for his hand. "Then I'll ride with you." He didn't kiss her then, but his hand closed around hers like it had been waiting to. They stood in the dark, the smell of horses and stew and wood smoke all around, and the wind brushed past them like it knew it was time to move on. When they stepped back inside, the fire was still warm and the table still set for 2. Lark reached for another bowl, ladled stew again, and handed it to him like they'd done it 100 times before. And maybe, in the life they were about to build, they would. Vaughn stayed 3 days at Shell Creek. He helped clear the lower pasture of fallen timber and dug a new trench from the water line to the barn. He slept in the tack room behind the hay bins, which Lark pretended not to know, though she always left the lantern lit later than it needed to be. On the 4th morning, he saddled up before daybreak. Lark stood by the shed sharpening a draw knife, sleeves rolled, her breath showing in the air. "You heading south?" she asked without looking up. "Yampa Valley." "A rancher there's offering 50 cents a day for winter prep." "Hard pay," she muttered. "Hard ground," he said. "But it'll buy fence posts and seed come spring." She set the draw knife down and wiped her hands on her skirt. "You want me to wait?" Vaughn tightened the cinch, adjusted the bridle. "I want you to keep building. I'll come back with what we need." She nodded. "Leave the rifle. We've got coyotes nosing around the henhouse." He handed it over without hesitation. Before he mounted, he hesitated, then reached inside his coat and drew out a folded piece of paper. He passed it to her. "What's this?" "Map to a claim I scouted near Owl Creek. Good soil, water runs clean, cabin need raising." Her eyes flicked over the lines, the hand-drawn notations. "You're serious?" "I wouldn't ask you to come if I wasn't." She folded it and tucked it into her waistband. "I'll look at it." He touched the brim of his hat, then rode out without another word. By the time the sun crested the ridge, he was gone. Lark didn't speak of the map to Mrs. Carrow, but that afternoon, when her chores were finished, she borrowed the mare and rode west along the creek. The air smelled of snow to come and the trees were nearly bare. She found the ridge Vaughn had marked on the map and stood there a long time, wind tugging at her collar. The land rolled gentle before her, sloping down toward a narrow stream. She could see it, what he meant. The shape of a future drawn into the earth. When she returned, Mrs. Carrow was mucking out the coop. "You take a wrong turn?" she asked without looking up. "No, ma'am." The older woman stood straight, leaning on her shovel. "You find something out there." Lark took off her gloves, fingers stiff from cold. "Found a place I might want to belong." Mrs. Carrow studied her face. "Then you'd best learn to hold it." The first snow came 2 weeks later, soft and steady, blanketing the hills in silence. The farm slowed. Lark spent more time mending harnesses and less in the fields. She slept with her coat near the stove and her hands cracked worse than before. Vaughn wrote once. The letter came folded into oilskin and smelled faintly of pine pitch. It was short. "Lark, snow's already knee-deep here. I'm bunking in the loft above the smokehouse. The men here are honest enough. I think of you more than I probably should. You still planning to come spring?" She read it once, then tucked it beneath the floorboard near her cot. By late January, she'd started collecting flat stones from the creek, stacking them behind the bunkhouse in a slow, careful circle. She said nothing, and Mrs. Carrow never asked what the stones were for. One night, the wind howled hard enough to rattle the windows. Lark couldn't sleep. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stepped outside, boots crunching frost. The sky was clear, brittle with cold. She stood a long time by the woodpile, staring east. When she turned, Mrs. Carrow was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You're not built to stay still," she said. "I'm trying." "No, you're waiting. That's different." Lark glanced down at her boots, then back at her. "You ever wait for someone? Once. He never came back. I built this place instead." They stood in silence, breath rising like ghosts. Then Mrs. Carrow pushed off the doorframe. "You've worked hard. You've earned more than another woman's roof." Lark didn't answer. But that night she pulled Vaughn's map from the floorboard and laid it out flat. By the third thaw, the horses were restless, hooves cutting through slush. Lark packed quietly. A sack of salt pork, a spool of thread, her journal, and the rifle Vaughn left. She saddled the mare before dawn. Mrs. Carrow watched her from the porch, arms wrapped in a shawl. "You sure?" "No," Lark said, "but I want it." Mrs. Carrow nodded once. "Then go." Lark rode out with the sun behind her, the road soft with melt. She carried no banner, no promise, just the weight of her own choosing. When she reached the rise above Owl Creek, the wind had stilled. A lean-to stood where the map said it would, smoke curling from a pipe angled through the roof. Vaughn stood outside, splitting wood. He looked up when he heard the hooves. She dismounted and tied the mare fast. "You didn't say you'd already started," she said. "I didn't want to ask for more than you'd already offered." She walked up to the lean-to, laid a hand on the rough beam. "You built this with no help." "I had help. I had your name in my head the whole time." She turned then, eyes steady on his. "I came to stay." He didn't answer. Just stepped closer and reached for her hand. This time, she didn't pull away. Inside, the fire was warm and the floor packed solid. A narrow cot sat beside a table, and a second bedroll had already been laid out beside it. She looked at it, then at him. "You always make space for what you hope. Only when I believe it'll be filled." She set her sack down and turned to face him fully. "I'm not easy," she said. "I don't bend right, I don't keep quiet." "I know," he said. "I like you wild." She smiled, sharp and real. "Then you've got me." He reached for her then, slow and certain, and she stepped into him like she'd done it all her life. The wind shifted outside, but inside the quiet held. They didn't speak after that. There was no need. The thaw deepened, and the creek behind the lean-to began to run faster, cold and clear with meltwater. Lark learned the sound of it in her sleep, the way it shifted after midnight when the moonlight hit it right. She kept her boots by the door, a habit from Shell Creek, and each morning she stepped out to check the sky before anything else. They worked in rhythm. Vaughn cut timber from the ridgeline and she stripped bark and cured planks behind the cabin. They dug post holes side by side, and though her hands blistered, she never slowed. He built the chimney, she chinked the walls. Neither said much while they worked, but there was more said in the way he handed her the water tin before she asked, or how she folded his shirts after washing them without being told. One afternoon, while she was mending the roofline, she called down to him as he split wood. "You ever think about having something more than this?" He set the axe aside and looked up at her, squinting into the sun. "Depends what you mean. I used to think I'd want a place in town, a real porch, neighbors close by. But now I don't know that I'd trade the quiet for anything." "You don't have to," he said. "Not unless you miss something you left behind." She swung her leg over the beam and sat with her feet dangling. "I don't miss much, but I keep thinking about what it'd mean to stay here for good. Not just through spring, through whatever comes next." He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked to the base of the ladder. "Then we make it a place that lasts." That evening, she cooked salt pork and carrots over the fire and watched him push a nail into the doorframe where he'd hung a strip of rawhide to dry. When he caught her watching, he nodded toward the hearth. "You ever want a stove?" "Eventually," she said. "But this'll do for now. I like the firelight. We'll have the roof done before the next rain. After that, I can ride north and bring back panes for the windows." She leaned against the table, arms folded. "And after that," he turned, hands loose at his sides, and met her eyes. "We talk about what kind of life we want. Together." She moved toward him slowly, her apron still damp from washing. "You sure you want to plan that far ahead with someone like me?" "I wouldn't want to with anyone else." She reached up, fingers brushing the corner of his jaw where the skin was still pink from the bottle scar. "Good. Because I'm not going anywhere." That night, he pulled her close beneath the patchwork quilt she'd been piecing together from old shirts and flour sacks. Her head rested against his chest, and the fire snapped low in the hearth. There was nothing left between them but breath and steady warmth. By late May, the cabin stood solid, with a door that closed right and glass in the windows. The garden rose they planted began to sprout, and Vaughn built a bench beneath the cottonwood where she liked to sit in the evenings. She spent afternoons stitching curtains while he rode out to check the trap lines they'd set through the low ravine. One morning, she stood at the edge of the creek, watching minnows dart through the shallows, when he came up behind her with something hidden in his hand. "I traded for this in Yampa," he said. "Wasn't fancy, but it was made right." She turned as he opened his palm. A narrow band of silver, etched with a pattern of pine needles and sky, simple, strong. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything at all. Just reached out and took it from him, then slid it onto her own finger. "I don't need a preacher," she said. "Neither do I." They married themselves that morning, standing barefoot in the creek, the sun cutting through the trees and the wind stilling just long enough to witness it. That summer, they built a corral and brought in a pair of milk goats from a rancher 20 miles off. Lark named them after wildflowers. Vaughn laughed but never argued. He carved her a butter churn from scrapwood, and she taught him how to stitch a button back in place. They slept with the windows open, the sounds of frogs and wind moving through the cottonwoods like a lullaby. She started writing in the little book he'd given her, not about the past, but about the days they were building, one after the next. Autumn came slow, with gold in the trees and the smell of dried grass. One evening, as they shelled beans on the porch, she looked out over the fence line they'd raised together and said, "I never thought I'd feel safe like this." He set the bowl aside and reached for her hand. "You are." "With me." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I know." Years passed. The cabin grew with them. A second room added the following spring, then a root cellar carved deep into the hillside. They kept chickens, then a mule, then two. Vaughn built a smokehouse and Lark planted apple trees behind the barn. When the first one bloomed, she pressed a blossom into the pages of her journal, beneath the place where she'd written his name. They grew older without growing apart. Some days were hard. Fence posts broke. Storms came early. There was sickness, too. A winter fever that left Lark shivering and Vaughn awake for 3 nights straight, spooning broth into her mouth with shaking hands. But she lived. They always did. One summer, a rider came with news from Shell Creek. Mrs. Carroll had passed, quiet in her sleep. Lark rode out alone to pay respects, and when she returned, she brought back a spindle and a pair of cracked sewing shears. She used these near every day, she said. Now I will. They never had children. It wasn't sorrowful, it simply wasn't. Their life was full without it. They had each other, and the land, and the kind of peace that doesn't ask for more to be enough. On their 10th year, Vaughn carved a notch into the cabin beam above the hearth. This place, he said, was just wood and dirt before you. They sat on the bench beneath the cottonwood, older now, hands calloused, hearts steady. The wind moved through the grass and the creek still sang. Lark rested her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes. This was always the life I wanted, she said. He kissed the top of her head, slow and certain, and it's the one we made, together.